Hello, my name's Krista Petley. I'm Professor of History at the University of Southampton, and I'm joined today by my colleague Dr. George Gilbert, who is an expert in Russian history. Hello, George.
Hello.
George, I'd like to start by asking you what made you interested in Russian history to begin with.
Okay, well, I first started studying Russian history when I was GCSE, so 14, 16 at secondary school. And the period I started looking at was Lenin and Stalin era in Russian history, so around the time of 1917 up until the mid to late 1930s. And I had very good teachers, but I was immediately drawn to the period because it's so exciting. Like, there's so much happens in terms of the events and the contingency of Russian history. Another thing I've always found very interesting about Russia, and I was kind of aware that even at quite an early stage of learning, was it's such a kind of a testing ground for ideas, kind of political ideologies that we see all around us in the world today. Things like Marxism, socialism, communism, anarchism have all been tried in Russia, all been tried and experimented with. And that's an interest that's always kind of shaped my reading of the period. And eventually I started going more back into the imperial period of Russian history, something we didn't do so much of at school, and reading about that. And I was always struck, I should say, by the parallels between the later periods and the early periods. But a complete reversal of kind of ideology in that sense, kind of conservative ideas about Russia's past, rather than some of the more radical left ideologies we look at in the kind of the Bolshevik period and later.
Thanks, George. We're going to ask you a little bit about that period now, of the Bolshevik Revolution, because, of course, the main reason that we're here is to talk about an A-level question, a potential A-level essay question about Nicholas II and the Russian Revolution. So the full question that we're thinking about today is, to what extent was Nicholas II responsible for the downfall of the Tsarist regime? So, George, if you were confronted with that question, how would you go about answering it?
Okay, well, it's an interesting question, and like all questions, there's different ways of going about doing it. The way I would maybe think about it is to maybe separate it into different strands of potential answer, maybe thinking about events and contingency, and also about social context and the structure of Russian society. But I think I might like to start with thinking about the people themselves. Of course, in that question title there is Nicholas II. I might like to start by thinking a little bit about him as a person and whether he was in fact responsible. Can we tie it to his personality? Something that's very important to say is that power in Russia was, in the eyes of the Tsars and their advisors, divinely ordained. The personality of the Tsar had an awful lot of impact in terms of what went on in the country, so it's quite fair, I think, to pose the question of whether the person themselves was responsible. Nicholas II, we know a fair bit about him as a person. He wrote all his thoughts down in a diary, and there's quite a good source record of his activity in late Imperial Russia around the time he was the Tsar, from 1894, his coronation, until 1917, of course, his abdication. And we've got, I think, a good insight into his personality. One thing historians have speculated about a bit is whether he was actually, as a person, well constituted to confront some of the challenges facing late Imperial Russia. Nicholas II was very family orientated. This comes out in his diary, where he doesn't actually write too much about politics or about the political changes sweeping Russia. He likes to write about his wife. He likes to write about picking mushrooms in fields. He doesn't really seem to be keyed in too much to some of the political changes sweeping Russia on a kind of an emotional or an intellectual level. So some historians have looked at this and have said, well, as a personality, was he really well placed to confront some of these challenges in a period that, as we shall see, was a very, very tumultuous and eventful one for Russia? And I think any Tsar might have had some difficulty facing these challenges.
So we've got Nicholas II then as a man who perhaps his head's elsewhere, his mind's elsewhere, and he's perhaps almost not that interested in the political and social changes that are transforming Russia at this time. This clearly is part of how we want to think about this question. Perhaps this man himself is part of the problem, but what you've already started, I think, George, to steer us towards are some of these big social and political transformations that this man, perhaps often a bit ineptly or very ineptly, has to struggle with. So what are those big social and political problems?
Well, it's a very good question, and kind of, if I'm allowed to unleash my inner Marxist for a bit, I would say that the social context is very, very important to understanding this period in history. Historians have often looked at this period thinking about it in a structural sense, thinking about some of the wider factors sweeping Russia and transforming the country into a country that was mostly a feudal system based around agriculture into a country that in some respects is quite a modern one. Urbanisation was occurring at a frequent rate in the late 19th and early 20th century, and under successive ministers of finance, Russia was transforming extensively. Historians often frame these questions about social context around key demographics in Russia. So the workers' movement, the rise of an educated working class, and the patterns of protest that leads to in the late imperial period and onwards, the rise of, say, Marxist ideas and parties in Russia has attracted an awful lot of interest. But of course, Russia in this period was mostly a peasant country. 80% of the population before the revolutions of 1917 were peasants, and historians have focused an awful lot on the land question and about the enormous kind of challenge of changing Russia into a different type of polity, a more modern polity, if you like, after the emancipation settlement of 1861. There's also other ways historians are starting to think about these questions of social context, maybe about changing patterns of gender relations in late imperial Russia, changing patterns of kind of lifestyle and activism involving both men and women, and also thinking about it in terms of its culture as well, the culture of late imperial Russia. And if we're thinking in terms of cultural change, historians have often pointed to the fact that the society was transforming very rapidly, that cultural patterns are in flux. We can see very kind of disruptive and kind of innovative patterns in terms of Russia's kind of cultural realm at the time, right up until 1917. So that's kind of some of the main questions that have informed historians' readings of the period in recent decades.
So we've got a world in transformation, a country in transformation in all of these ways, George, that you're describing, and a leader that's not perhaps that well equipped to deal with those sorts of changes. And of course, one of the things that's going to test him are the big events, when these social tensions that you've described lead to a crisis of one sort or another. How did Nicholas manage those big crises when they happened?
Well, yes, another way of kind of thinking about the period that I think is useful in terms of kind of structuring an answer to this could be to think about, as you say, Christopher, events and contingencies being really important. Things start off quite positively in 1894 when Nicholas II is crowned as Tsar. His accession, his coronation are quite positive events. They draw enormous crowds of people. At that point, things look quite positive for the autocracy. Nicholas II's advisors might look at the crowds of people on the street at his coronation and think, wow, we've got quite a lot of public support here. But in the later 19th century, right at the end, the turn of the 20th century, things start to go quite badly for the autocracy. In 1896, we have the Kadinka catastrophe, where a large number of people are killed on a crash on a field. And it's said that the Tsar and his advisors may be quite slow to grasp the kind of the anxieties and the upset this causes amongst the population who are involved in that catastrophe. And of course, in this era,
a crush on a field.
A large number of people killed in like a crowd crush trying to observe this kind of like a popular event in Kadinka in 1896. And it's said by some that the Tsar and his advisors are maybe quite slow to grasp the fact this caused an awful lot of disaffection. People are very, very unhappy about this. You see a similar thing happen, I think, several years later in 1905, when you have the start of that revolution. Father Capon deliver his manifesto to the Winter Palace on 9th of January, and after a kind of a tense standoff for several hours, a large number of troops, loyalist troops loyal to the regime, open fire on this crowd of peaceful demonstrators. They do have with them a set of demands. Some of them are quite political, but again, it suggested maybe that this is a weakening popular faith in the Tsar. The fact that these attacks on the people, this lack of feeling maybe to these kind of enormous events that are occurring on the part of the Tsar and his advisors, is kind of leading to an increasing feeling of distance between the Tsar and his people. That kind of link between the Tsar and his people is breaking down in the face of this enormous contingency. We also have, of course, just before 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, a wartime crisis that again I think poses questions about the direction of the Russian state and about its leaders, about their ability to in that case, the Russo-Japanese War waged a modern conflict in the period, and whether they could do so with any success. And these questions were intensified in the run-up until 1905, a revolutionary moment of Russian history where maybe the Tsar and his advisors perhaps are faced with crises that they maybe don't fully understand.
So we've got then a situation in Russia where lots of things are changing, socially, culturally, politically, and we've got these important events taking place that bring all these things to a head, and a man at the top, Tsar Nicholas II, who seems completely unable to deal with these things, partly because he's thinking about other things. He's got his mind elsewhere. It sounds to me, George, as though someone else in charge might have dealt with these things in a different way and perhaps averted the Russian Revolution. Is that a fair assessment of things, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that over the longer term, some of these events, I think, so if we take, for example, the land question, the inability to untie the Gordian knot after emancipation of 1861, or the rise of a workers' movement, these events can be traced well back into the 19th century, before Nicholas II becomes the Tsar. And I think this would have happened regardless of who the Tsar was. And I think any Tsar would have struggled to channel, I think, the forces unleashed during those processes that are so enormous and are so transformational for Russian society, Russian culture, Russian politics. I think there's also the question about the organisation of these revolutionary movements themselves, about the organisation of the opposition that we maybe haven't talked about too much so far, but you might want to think about their successes in challenging the old regime. Why did these ideas manage to catch on? Why did revolution, for example, as an ethos, attract people in Tsarist Russia? A lot of the conditions of social life, for most people, the poverty of the country, the banality and misery of everyday life, I think these social factors would have gained traction and would have gained some form of resistance to autocracy, regardless of who the Tsar actually was. And that's not to say Nicholas II was not important and that he didn't make mistakes. I think he did make key mistakes that impinged upon the period's general trajectory. But I think to have a full answer to this question, I would think we need to look beyond the personality and to think about wider society in a structural sense.
Thank you. I suppose we'll never really know, because it's impossible to rerun history with different factors, a different Tsar. But it sounds as though, from what you're arguing then, that even the most politically astute of Tsars would have found it very difficult to deal with these issues that confronted Nicholas and that culminate in the Russian Revolution. George, is there anything else you wanted to add by way of tying this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that maybe is a key question on students' minds and might help you think a bit about structure is this question about the war, which we haven't talked about too much. Of course, the First World War and the run-up between the war and the revolutions in 1917. Did the war cause the revolution? And I think if you're thinking about that in a shorter term sense, you might want to think quite critically about the personality of Nicholas II and some of the mistakes he made. So one thing I would note here that historians have looked at a lot is in 1915 he makes himself commander-in-chief of the Russian army. The war isn't going well for Russia. He thinks that if he takes charge of the military situation, it'll inspire some sort of improvement. His advisors plead with him, don't do this, they say. It's a very bad idea. The war's not been going well. To become commander-in-chief, you will tie yourself intimately to the military mistakes and the terrible things going on the battlefield. Nicholas II ignores his advisors and says, no, I want to make myself commander-in-chief. I think that people need a leader and a Tsar like me. And it doesn't elicit any sort of improvement in Russia's situations. That's just one example I think you could take if you want to argue for the personality. You could maybe look quite closely at sort of potential turning points, maybe potential mistakes or incorrect judgments made by the Tsar and his inner circle, and think how they contribute to the wider flow of history.
That's great. Thank you, George. I think that's a really useful and helpful roundup, not just of the question and how you'd answer it, but all of the sorts of different ways that we might approach this as a question. So thank you very much for your time.
Right, thanks.